Today we're going to go through prompting fundamentals. So this will give you everything you need to know to go from 0 to 100 in terms of prompt engineering, getting the best out of your LLMs and all that sort of stuff. So before we begin, we should talk about what a good prompt is. So a good prompt is just a way to get the most value out of a large language model. Now, if you've watched my previous videos, you probably already know what a large language model is, but for those of you who are watching my video for the first time, large language model is an AI model similar to ChatGPT. So ChatGPT is actually an application. The underlying large language model there is GPT-4o, GPT-4 or GPT 3.5 Turbo. So large language models will generally take in text and then will generate a completion, so output other text based on what you put into it. So in the case of ChatGPT, you type in some sort of message and the underlying large language model will then output some text as a response to you. So that's sort of how large language models work in sort of 2 sentences. But today in this video, we're going to be going through how you can come up with good prompts to get the most value out of these large language models. Now, it's very important that we cover these fundamentals because even as we learn more advanced techniques like chain of thought, all that sort of stuff, we need to understand what it is we're actually doing and the building blocks behind what we're doing. Now, I say all that, but a lot of this stuff is still in development. It's rapidly changing sort of every day, every week. There's changes to prompting. And these techniques, they work based on the current models available today and people's testing, but these techniques may not necessarily work in a year's time, in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time as models change. The other thing to sort of call out quickly is these techniques, people will generally agree that they work, but the specific reason as to why they work is still up for debate. Like, people obviously have a lot of theories and hypotheses as to why these techniques work. For example, chain of thought, getting the model to think through each step. There's obviously explanations you can put behind that, but the specific underlying reasons within the model for why this sort of prompting yields better results is still up for debate. Now, before I dive in, I just want to quickly shout out a couple of blogs that I very frequently refer to and I also referred to for this video. So first is a blog from Eugene Yan. So he writes lots of really good practical, but also quite technical pieces on building with large language models and AI more generally. Simon Willison, so I've been following his blog for a while now. I think he's one of the people behind Django, a Python framework, and recently he's been coming out with lots of great LLM and just generally AI content. Final shout out here is for Jason Liu. I follow him on Twitter, lots of very practical advice and writing on LLMs and even more broadly. So just wanted to give credit. In this video, I've sort of pulled in a lot of different sources, but those 3 sources I would say are the primary sources for this video. Cool. So first of all, what is prompt engineering? So like I mentioned before, LLMs basically are probabilistic models. You give them an input and they will give you an output based on what you've inputted and the patterns that they've learned from their training. So prompt engineering is basically just conditioning and steering these language models, right? It's just steering a powerful but ultimately directionless tool. And to give you an example of this, right, each additional token or each piece of context you put into your prompt will drastically change the output, or can have the ability to drastically change the output. So this is an example, right? So I'm going to go here into the Anthropic workbench. You can do this in sort of Claude as well. You can do it in ChatGPT if you want. I'm just going to use the workbench here. Actually, let's just do this. So I'll say, tell me about Apple. So I'm using Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which everyone's sort of raving about the past couple of days. Let's say, tell me about Apple, right? And it's likely going to refer to Apple, the company, right? Now, if I go back here and copy my second prompt, and it's exactly the same prompt, just with one extra word, which is fruit, so an additional piece of context and probably 1 or 2 extra tokens, let's start a new conversation and see what happens. The output is likely going to be completely different. See, it's now talking about fruit, completely different. So prompt engineering is this concept of changing the input tokens or the input context in order to drive and get the best output out of the model. And obviously, if I do tell me about apple of my eye, it's going to tell me about that proverb or that saying instead of apple the fruit or apple the company. Yep. Now, that's what prompt engineering is, or just coming up with a good prompt is. The more advanced techniques that you might have seen in other videos or on other sources like end-shot prompting, chain of thought, all that sort of stuff, those are just more advanced ways of doing this conditioning and steering. Ultimately, all of this is just to help us get the best output out of large language models, AI models. Cool. So first we're going to talk through a very popular prompt engineering technique, which is giving the model a role or responsibility. So you've probably seen this before. If you've watched my previous AI automation videos, you see that I do this a lot in my prompting. So an example of this is if I go into Anthropic, and then what I will do usually is, let's say I'm getting the AI model to write a blog post. What I often start with as my initial prompt is, you are a world-class copy technical content writer, right? So what I'm doing here is giving the AI model a role. And then from here, if I have the time and the context, I will give it more responsibilities, right? Like, you are a world-class technical writer. The user will provide you with a keyword. You will respond with a blog post formatted. So here I've given it a role as well as responsibility. It's obviously very basic, but just shows the I guess the concept behind what I'm talking about here, the power of roles and responsibilities. And this can drastically change the output, right? So the example I've got here is sort of preschool teacher and like a university professor. The output will be quite different in terms of the complexity of the words being used, the phrasing, all that sort of stuff. But even like something like this, right? This is just, if you do world-class technical content writer versus like you are a comedian, the output that you get from the model will be completely different. And I've just seen this actually. Looks like Anthropic has added a generate prompt function, which I actually haven't tried before. So this must be new. So I'm keen to try that. Maybe we'll try it later in this video. But let's say we do impact of AI on workforce. So right now I'm saying you're a technical content writer. Let's see what comes out. So it's writing like this, right? Pretty standard, nothing too amazing. If I change this to, you are a high school student as an example, let's see if the words being used, the tone, the phrasing will change. Now there's not going to be a huge difference here because we're still getting it just to write a blog post, but let's see what the difference is, right? So you've given it a different role. So now it says as a high school student. And you can see that the paragraphs are a bit simpler and the examples given are a bit simpler as well. So yeah, that's sort of a very basic prompt engineering technique. Give the large language model a role or responsibility. Second one is around structured input and output. Now, this is less valuable if you're just using ChatGPT or Claude directly. This is more useful if you're building AI automations or if you're building AI applications. Because generally what will happen when you're building some sort of product or an automation is there will be a recurring need to pass in information into your large language model that you're using and getting a consistent output. So as an example, right, what we usually do in a lot of our automations is generate blog posts. Now you can get ChatGPT or Claude just to generate just a straight up blog post, right? But when you're actually building the automation or you're building the AI application, what you'll generally need is for that output to be split into different fields. So you'll need the output to have, as an example, you will need the output to have, let's say, you'll need the output to have the title, you'll need to have tags, you'll need to have description, and then you'll have the actual content of the blog post, right? So you can't just have it all come out in one blob like this, because you won't be able to then feed in the specific fields into, let's say, WordPress or Webflow or whatever system that you need to pass the output into. So this technique of having structured input and structured output is critical if you're building AI apps or AI automations. Now, where it gets confusing is depending on the large language model that you're using, and generally it varies by provider, the way you format your structured input and output can impact the performance of the model. So famously, Anthropic models, specifically the Claude 3 series, does very well with XML tags. So just to give you an example, right? XML tags look like this. Anything wrapped in these tags here, like these open and close tags. So for title, I might do something like this, and then title, right? And then tag, I might do like this. Anyways, you get the point. So this is a XML tag. For OpenAI, generally what does better is either just straight Markdown or you use JSON, right? So you can, if you've watched my previous AI automation videos, I will often say, please respond in the format with the following JSON object, and I'll turn on JSON mode, and I will do stuff like title is a string, and then I will do description is a string, and so on and so forth, right? So I'll do this for OpenAI models. So in both cases, we are just doing structured input and output, but the specific formats that we're using or the tags that we're using will differ by the model we're using, because different models tend to behave slightly differently. But yeah, so that's sort of structured intake and input and output. And if you're just using just ChatGPT or Claude directly, you don't really need to do this in most cases. But if you're building an AI automation or you're building an AI app with the underlying APIs, chances are you're already doing this, or you do need to do this. Next prompt engineering technique I have is called prefilling. So the way I usually use this, and you can use this in many more ways, but just to give you an example, is for JSON mode. So just from the previous technique we talked about, which is structured input and output, sometimes you want the output to be a JSON object, right? And if you're using OpenAI models, the newer models all have a JSON mode. So JSON mode lets you force the output to be in JSON, but Anthropic doesn't have a built-in JSON mode within their API yet. So what they actually suggest is to use prefilling to increase the chances of getting a JSON output. And what that basically means is you have your system prompt and you have your user prompt, and what you can do then is pre-fill the assistant's response. So you're saying that assistant is going to respond, but the first couple of characters or the first couple of words are going to be this. So you're already putting words into the large language model's mouth, so to speak. Now, if you're doing this within make.com, just to show you how this would work, you could do something like this. So let's say we're using OpenAI and we're making a completion. So what you can do here is put in the user and say, like, write a blog post about, anyway, just imagine I've written the prompt that I had before here, right? You're a high school student, all that sort of stuff. What you can actually do here is put in the system and say, like, you want your blog to start a certain way, or you want it to just always respond with like title always starts with like AI the mystified. Maybe you're writing a blog series or something, right? You can just leave your you can leave your this should be assistant. So you can force your assistant to start its message with this, and then it will complete from this onwards. Now, when you're doing this, you have to be careful, because oftentimes the output you get from the module or from the API will just be the characters after this. So as an example, if you're doing a JSON output, make sure to add in this initial snippet, because otherwise when you parse the JSON, it's gonna break. So just a quick call out there. Now, output JSON is not sort of the only way to use prefilling. You can just use it in any other way as well. Like maybe you just want your blog post to start a certain way, or you want to give a bit more steering. So maybe if you're writing a blog post and you've already got the first paragraph, you could sort of put that in to give the assistant or the model a bit more of a steer. Cool. Next prompt engineering technique we're going to go through is called n-shot prompting, right? So n refers to just any number of examples, is basically just giving the model examples, right? And this is probably one of the oldest prompt engineering techniques, but it's also probably one of the most effective. And as it sounds, it's just giving the model an example. So if you want the model to classify sentiment, maybe you'll give it 5 examples, 10 examples, 30 examples first. and then get the model to then give you a output. So as an example, please classify the sentiment of the following statement. And I'll write like, this is crappy. So it should be negative, right? Now this example, you probably don't need to give examples because it's quite straightforward. But if you're doing something a bit more niche, something a bit more custom to your business, oftentimes you will need to give examples just so the model kind of gets an idea of what you're doing. And the analogy for this is if you've hired a new intern or a new employee, generally when you're upskilling them or teaching them, you will give them a few examples. So it's effectively the same thing here. So then what you will do, since I'm using Claude, I will just say examples. And within here, I'm just going to give some examples, right? So I might say this is negative. And then is positive. So I'm just giving examples, and make sure don't give too few examples. You want to give enough examples so that the model doesn't overfit on a small number of examples in context. Now, as I mentioned again, before someone comments, this specific case, I probably wouldn't give examples for because it's so easy, but this is just to give you an example of if you have more custom requirements, you will usually give the model some examples just so that it does perform a bit better. Cool. Now, getting into a bit more advanced prompt engineering techniques, the next one is chain of thought. Now, there's lots of variants of this, but the most basic is really just to say, think step by step. So if you're asking the model a question, and you can use this technique even if you're just using Claude or ChatGPT, even if you're not building automations or that sort of stuff, you can just say like, help me write a React component for an auth page as an example, think through it step by step. And adding that think through step by step will actually improve the output that you get from the model. Now that's the most basic form of chain of thought prompting. And there's a lot of sort of hypotheses around why this works. It's sort of because you're getting the model to think through the steps. So it's writing out the steps. It reduces the potential completions because it's already written out some parts of the answer before it gives you the final output. So lots of theories there, but at the end of the day, it's just a technique that has been shown to work. I think there was another paper that just says, think through it step by step to get to the right answer, performs even better. But yeah, there's lots of variants on this. And as I said before, different models will react slightly differently to these different prompt engineering techniques. So depending on the model that you're using, you will still need to test. But it's just something that you can add to your toolkit. So you know, like there's a sort of high probability thing that you can test. Anyways, so we'll think through the steps, then we'll write the code, all that sort of stuff. It's a pretty easy task for Claude 3.5, so probably didn't need the chain of thought prompting, but doesn't hurt, right? So just another technique for you to play with. Cool. Next one, divide and conquer. Now, this is a bit harder to use if you're just using Claude or ChatGPT, which is just the application layers. This is much easier if you're building an AI application and you're writing the code, or you're building an AI automation. So what this is you have a big master prompt, and this is slowly getting into the realm of agents, right? You have a big master prompt, you get it to break down into smaller prompts into smaller steps, right? And then for each of the steps, you get the AI model to complete each step individually before you finally put it all together. Now, an example that I've done of this on my channel previously is writing super long form content. So if you've used ChatGPT directly and you just wanted to write a long blog post, it can be hard for it to write just a long blog post in one shot or one pass of the model. So usually what I would recommend is you get ChatGPT, you give it like your prompt for the content, get it to come out with a content brief with each of the subheadings or the subtitles in your blog post, and then you pass in each of the subheadings into another prompt to generate each of the sections individually before you combine them. So that's an example of this divide and conquer approach. By breaking up the task into smaller tasks, it just makes it easier for the large language models. And this is just something that people have drawn a parallel to with, I guess, humans. Generally, when you have a big problem to solve, you usually do better when you break it into smaller problems, solve each of them one by one, and then all of a sudden you've solved the bigger problem as well. And just here, there's an example from AlphaCodium, which I believe was is a sort of like GitHub Copilot competitor, and they've got much higher accuracy by breaking single prompts into multiple steps. Next one here is not necessarily a prompt engineering technique, but is a concept that is good to know, and it's around context placement. So if you've been around the LLM AI space for a while, you'll know that initially models started with a context window of like 2,000 or 4,000 tokens, right? Which is like 3,000 words or something like that. Over time, it went up to 16,000, 32,000, 128,000, and now Gemini has like 2 million tokens, right? So you can increasingly put more and more text into these large language models to drive their output. Problem is, when these larger context models initially came out, there were a couple of research papers around the fact that the model wasn't necessarily treating the whole context window equally. So if you had content at the beginning or the end of your model, the model was able to understand and retrieve that pretty well. But if you had content in the middle of your model, in the middle of your input, the model sometimes wouldn't refer to it or wouldn't be able to retrieve it as well. So what I'm referring to is the needle in a haystack test. So let me pull it up. So basically it looks something like this, right? So this is when I think Claude initially came out with a 200,000 context window. Basically each of these corresponds to, I don't know, 10,000 or 1,000 tokens. And basically, like, as it gets, you can see sort of like they're putting needles or like specific pieces of words into a very long piece of text that they're putting into the model and getting the model to try and find this hidden word. Well, it's not really hidden, but this like special word. And you can see the red part is where the model fails. So you can see that generally it's sort of in the middle of the model where the retrieval gets worse. But this sort of issue where the model isn't able to retrieve from the middle of their context and that sort of stuff is slowly not really that relevant anymore. The newer models don't seem to struggle as much with this. And then also I've seen people anecdotally say that you can just prompt engineer around this. Like if you are a bit more creative with your prompting, the models don't sort of run into these issues nearly as much as people sort of claimed initially when these larger context window models came out. Anyways, just something to be aware of, not necessarily a prompting technique, but something to be aware of in your AI app builds and AI automation builds. Cool. Next one is not a technique, more of a guideline, is just short, simple sentences seem to work best. When you make your prompt super long, sometimes it confuses the model, and it sort of relates back to this context placement piece. Like if you're just super clear and short in your prompt, it tends to work better. Again, the newer models tend to do better with this, but doesn't hurt to keep your prompts shorter. You save some tokens, model will probably respond faster. So it's sort of wins all around. So just something to keep in mind here as well. Now, hallucination. Now, this is a big problem with large language models. And it's probably a huge problem if you're working with any sort of enterprise or critical business processes. Now, at this point in time, there is no way to completely eliminate hallucinations. You can obviously get the AI to have a fallback response where it says like, I don't know, or it refuses to answer. You can have guardrails where you force the model to respond in JSON as an example. But what I mean by hallucination is it's giving you an output that is like valid in the fact that it's responded, but maybe the underlying facts in that response are wrong, right? That's what I mean by hallucination. So there's no perfect solution for this, but generally you can add in fallback or just I don't know responses, and using other techniques we went through before, like chain of thought, will help mitigate this. So no way to completely solve this. You can have, if you're building an AI app, I would recommend designing for this in your UI, but no way around this at this point in time. And it's something, if you're working with lots of clients, to align expectations on so that they don't expect this and you don't end up with a crisis on your hands where they're using AI for super critical processes where hallucination is not feasible or not allowed, and then the LLM or the AI system that you've built then hallucinates, right? So just something to keep in mind there. Stop sequences. Again, not something useful if you're just using Claude or ChatGPT directly, but super useful if you're building AI apps or AI automations. So what this is just a way for you to get the model to stop whenever it outputs a certain character or set of characters. So as an example, if you're doing JSON mode output in Anthropic Claude and they don't have a specific JSON mode setting, what you can do is you can set stop. Let me find it. You can set the stop sequences. Let me find it. Stop sequences. So for in this case, I might set the stop sequences to the closing tags of my JSON object. So then every time it closes JSON, it'll stop. Again, like this was very useful in the earlier days where the models were not as, I guess, reliable in following instructions. These days, the models generally are quite good. So this is less useful. But again, if you're productionizing, building an AI automation or AI app, I would highly recommend using this where possible. It just gives you that sort of fixed deterministic stop point for your AI outputs. Because sometimes it will sort of give you the JSON output and then also just write a whole paragraph, which will break your JSON parsing and that sort of stuff. Next one, temperature. Again, not useful if you're using ChatGPT directly or Claude because you can't control these. But if you're using the API in your AI apps or AI automations, temperature is a very useful setting. Now, you can think of temperature as randomness or like the creativity dial on AI. Anecdotally, people have said that higher setting means that the AI model is smarter, but it also makes it harder to have consistency in your automation and app. So guideline that I generally tell people, start with 0.7, 0.8, and then just test from there. If you find that the AI model is not responding in the way that you want, then probably lower the temperature so it becomes more consistent. So just to be clear here, if your temperature is set to 0, every time you give the AI model or the large language model the same input, it should respond with this exact same output. As you increase your temperature, the output will change every single time. So that's what they mean by creativity dial. Cool. Now, a couple of things that are mattering less. Now, I mentioned some of the other ones are slowly starting to matter less, but these are also. So one is politeness and threats. So if you've been around the prompt engineering space for a while, you'll know that for a while there were people talking about giving threats to the AI. So things like, if you don't help me do this, the world will end, or like your grandma is hostage, all that sort of crazy stuff. And then there was also stuff like, if you help me do this, I'll give you a $200 tip, that sort of stuff. Doesn't seem to be as effective these days with the newer models. So yeah, not that much point in doing it unless you're just scared of the AI overlords taking over and you want to be polite, then all power to you. But in terms of output effectiveness, not super useful these days. And then, yeah, same thing, social niceties before seem to have some sort of impact, but these days, not so much. Cool. Now, as we slowly wrap up, I want to emphasize what I mentioned at the beginning. As these new models come out, there's new models coming out every couple of weeks, the approach to prompting for each model needs to be quite different because the models would respond quite different to different prompt engineering techniques. You can test this yourself, right? Just put the exact same prompt into ChatGPT and Claude, and you'll oftentimes get quite different responses. So the techniques work the same as well. Like a technique that may have worked 6 months ago may not work now, may not work in 2 years' time. So what I've tried to do today is just capture the current state of prompt engineering to the sort of extent that I can. And I know that this will evolve over time, and maybe even sort of a week or two after this video, things will have changed. So feel free to comment below if by the time you're watching this video, some of these things are no longer true, or maybe you've discovered other things that I haven't covered here. Feel free to comment below so that we can all stay up to date together. Cool. Regardless of all that, I think prompt engineering is still critical at this point in time. I know a lot of people saying in the future, prompt engineering will not be useful because AI models will be smart enough to not require prompt engineering. And honestly, I do believe that we're just not there yet. So at this point in time, if you are building in AI, working in AI, just using AI for your work or business, I still recommend, prompt engineering a little bit. And honestly, if you've watched this full video, you're you're probably already better than like 95% of people. So you should probably already have everything you need to know. Just apply what we've covered today and you are set. Now, I'm going to wrap up this video, but if you have any thoughts, questions, or feedback, feel free to leave a comment below. If you need help upskilling your team on how to use AI or just applying AI or automations in your business or work, feel free to reach out. I do offer AI consulting. But with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something today. And if you did, please give this video a like and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. And I'll see you in my next video.